Hello, everyone. Will Ostan. Welcome back to Fight in the Shade podcast. I have an extremely special episode and guest for you today. I'm here with my new friend, Mr. Timothy Riley, who is the director and chief curator of America's National Churchill Museum here on the Westminster College campus in Fulton, Missouri. And we are actually taping on Saturday, August 15th, which I didn't realize it, but Mr. Riley told me this is the 75th anniversary of Victory over Japan Day. So it's already special enough that we are in this recreation of the Clementine Spencer Churchill Reading Room with Mr. Riley, but it's also VJ Day, the 75th anniversary. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm really going to turn this over to Mr. Riley because he is America's resident expert on Winston Churchill. He's just given me a 40-minute tour of the National Churchill Museum. And if you haven't gone back and watched that video podcast episode, you have to watch it. You can't just listen to it, although he is extremely articulate and you could just do it in audio, but you have to watch it because you will actually hear and see things that you've never heard and seen before about Churchill. You'll hear air raid sirens like they heard back in the 40s and 41s during the Blitz. All right. So, Mr. Riley, thank you so much for giving us the honor and welcome, sir.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm really glad you're here, and I'm pleased that, again, as you say, this is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, so it's appropriate that we have a chat about Churchill.
It really is. So let's dive right in. Tell us, how did the America's National Churchill Museum, how did it get established?
Well, we were open 50 years ago in 1969, and throughout the 1960s there was an effort to establish a memorial to Winston Churchill here, because at Westminster College in 1946, Churchill gave a famous speech here on the campus. He gave the Iron Curtain speech, which he entitled "The Sinews of Peace," warning of the Soviet aggression and that an Iron Curtain was descending across the continent of Europe. That speech ultimately led the West to reevaluate the relationship with the Soviet Union, who had been allies in World War II. We forget that, but were adversaries in the latter half of the 20th century. And Churchill here at Westminster College gave the playbook for how we might stand up to the Soviet Union and communism. That happened here. And
Wow.
as in the 1960s, fast forward, there was an effort to create a memorial to Winston Churchill and that speech because of the significance of, Winston Churchill said on the train ride home after delivering the address here at Fulton, that was one of the most significant speeches I have ever given.
He knew it right away.
He knew it.
Wow.
And he had given a lot of speeches
Sure.
that were significant.
That's right.
So, he knew the importance of what he had done here.
Wow.
And so it was definitely something that the college wanted to do in the 1960s, to build a museum and a memorial to that. And this is the product of it. And it was a bold idea. It was a bold idea to invite Churchill to Fulton in the first place, and he accepted. It was an equally bold idea to establish a museum by bringing over a Christopher Wren church from central London to the middle of Missouri.
Unbelievable. Talk to us about that unbelievable story.
That's the centerpiece. It's the largest work in our collection. The museum is underground, almost in a bunker below this 17th century church, which stood proudly in London for 300 years until December 29th, 1940. At the height of the Blitz, the Germans dropped 20,000 incendiary bombs on the city of London on the evening of the 29th of December. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin at Aldermanbury, not far from St. Paul's, the great Christopher Wren Church of St. Paul's Cathedral, Aldermanbury was hit. It burned. And the only thing that remained the morning after was the stone shell of the building.
Wow.
It was gutted. And it stood in ruins in London for 20 years. And when the college decided to build a memorial to Winston Churchill, after all, the ultimate symbol of being knocked down and getting back up again, what better way than to bring this bombed-out church from the Blitz, rebuild it here in the United States. And that Christopher Wren Church is the ultimate symbol of steadfastness in the face of adversity.
I love it.
And the crown of the museum here.
And it's beautiful. I mean, you would never know by walking around it or inside of it that it was actually a bombed out shell. You would just think it was built brand new because it looks so pristine.
Yeah, it was writers for the Sunday Times in London said in the 1960s, after the building was reconstructed here, was the greatest. It was the greatest jigsaw puzzle in the history of architecture. Every stone was numbered and put back together. It was an incredible undertaking.
It's fascinating. All right, we're gonna get in. Actually, before I transition, I want to talk about Churchill's resiliency. Because that's what this building stands for, like you said. So that would be a perfect segue. But before we go into that, I want you to talk about who actually gave the invitation to Churchill, and then how but who else was involved. You know where I'm going with that. Please tell that
Well,
story.
It's a great story. 75 years ago this summer, in 1945, I'll take you back for a moment. Remember that VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day, happened on May 8th.
Right.
Churchill celebrated, as did all of Europe, that the war was finally over. The battle in Japan raged on until today, 75 years ago. But the Victory in Europe Day was a great chance to celebrate and rejoice. Not long after that, there was a general election in Britain. And Churchill's party lost the election.
Right.
So Churchill won the war,
Right.
but he lost his seat as prime minister.
Right.
The most popular figure and face in the world is out of power.
Right.
Americans can't understand how that would happen.
Sure.
It's a parliamentary system. They like Churchill, but they voted for the party.
That's
and
right.
The party lost.
That's right.
And Churchill's out of power. So Churchill's out of a job. And he's moping about. His mental health took a beating. His family was concerned. He went off on a painting holiday in Italy and France, and refreshed his battery after 6 years of being a war leader.
Right.
And then he gets a letter, a one-page typewritten letter from Westminster College, this small, very nice, good liberal arts college in the middle of America that I'm sure he's never heard of before.
Right.
Saying, why don't you come and give our John Finley Green Foundation lecture, sir? Great invitation. And I'm sure Churchill would have given that letter to secretary, said, tell them I can't possibly come, but be kind and thank them.
Right.
However, there's a little note in the bottom of this letter, written in longhand, that says, this is a wonderful school in my home state. If you come, I'll introduce you. Harry Truman. And Churchill sees that letter. I mean, he glosses over the typewritten part about this lecture series that he didn't really care about, but he knew that if Truman was inviting him and would be on the same stage with him, the world would tune in.
Right.
So suddenly his spirits are lifted. Right. The election loss is distant memory, and he's getting back up again. And he knows he has more to say. And he uses the time between October, when the invitation arrived, and he read it, and March of '46, when he delivered the speech, to craft a message and to craft a stern warning to the West that the Soviet Union, our former allies in World War II, was the next and looming threat. And in that Iron Curtain speech here, Churchill outlines what it would take for the West, specifically the Anglo-American alliance, the special relationship,
right.
the term we use today, was
right.
coined in that speech here.
Right. Oh, I didn't know that.
And,
wow.
and it's the first time he really uses it, and says, if America and Britain can stand up together, we can defeat the expansion of communist doctrine in Europe. And he lays that all out in the Iron Curtain speech, which he called the sinews of peace.
Right.
Actually, we called
right.
it sinews. What are sinews? Sinews
Sure.
are things that bind us together.
Mm-hmm.
And if he knew that the alliance would bind them together in strength to overcome the aggression or perceived aggression of the Soviet Union, and that happened here.
So that's amazing to me. I knew about the Iron Curtain, in that speech, but I did not know the sinews of peace. I did not know the special relationship. You would have thought with his wooing of, President Roosevelt, back in the beginning of World War II, that maybe one of the speeches then, elucidated that that phrase. But that's amazing.
Well, Churchill knew from an early age, as early as the first decade of the 20th century, as a young man, the importance of America on the world stage, and the relationship between Britain and America. and he never said the special relationship really until Fulton.
Wow.
But the idea and sentiment for what it stood for was something that was in his DNA. His
Of
mother
course,
was American.
his mother was American, right?
So he
Right.
knew that, and particularly in the wake of World War II, the relationship, there was a power imbalance. Britain stood very firm before the war, but was exhausted after the war, broke, bankrupt. Churchill knew full well that not only was there a military alliance that was needed, but there was a financial alliance that needed to be made for Britain to really recover. So there was a number of layers of motives here, but ultimately, ideologically, Churchill knew that the values of, as he says in the Iron Curtain speech, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights,
Right.
the Constitution, all of it comes into its greatest form in the Declaration of Independence.
That's exactly right.
And he says that here, saying, it's liberty, and
That's right.
it's the pursuit of these ideals that bind the two
That's right.
nations together at their core.
Right.
From habeas corpus to the Bill of
Mhm.
Rights, it's all there
Right.
for Winston Churchill, and he says that quite clearly. In fact, he points out the Declaration of Independence. A British man coming to the middle of America to talk about the Declaration is very brave.
You bet, right.
But he does so, and he means it.
Yeah.
And he believes that those principles of freedom and liberty will defeat, as he says in the Iron Curtain speech, the two marauders. What are the marauders? War and tyranny. And only if we embrace this relationship, this relationship of allies who believe in freedom and liberty, do we have a chance of defeating the two marauders of war and tyranny. So the speech is much more about that than the line in Iron Curtain.
Absolutely.
It's a 50-minute speech.
Right.
And Churchill on the train ride home said that was the most significant speech
Right.
I've ever given. He knew it.
Right.
And sometimes as a writer or a speaker, when you've nailed it. Well, he knew. People didn't, though. The public didn't really know.
Interesting.
They didn't get it. I mean, this was. Remember that the Soviet Union had been our allies.
Sure.
The Soviets sacrificed so
right,
much
right,
during the war.
Right, on the Russian
And
front. Right.
So Churchill was accused of being a warmonger, of stirring the pot.
Yeah, sure.
Uncle Joe, well, he's one of us. Why are you saying we need to stand up?
Yeah.
And it's that prescience, again, it's that Churchill seeing,
Right.
just as he did in the 30s,
Right.
and warning about Hitler and Germany. He does so again. In fact, in the Iron Curtain speech, he says, "The last time I spoke and no one would listen. Surely, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot let that happen
Right.
again."
Right.
And the speech is, the more you read it and the more you unpack it, it's much more than that single famous phrase, the Iron Curtain, or the special relationship. I like to tell students or young people, if you're going to learn how to build an argument, read the Iron Curtain speech. It's not only a well-crafted speech from a rhetorical standpoint, but the argument is there to build, to the end of how alliances need to happen, and it should be. It's the ultimate playbook for building alliances.
So as we walk through the museum, you pointed out, Churchill always had a flair for the dramatic, or he wanted to stand out from the crowd. He wanted to be identified, and so it seems that he knew, okay, this is my opportunity. It's post World War II, been kicked out of office. I'm battling maybe some of the Black Dog Depression that we'll talk about, and then he sees that little footnote from President Truman, and so he really takes the time to craft a tremendous speech. So maybe, and I'm speculating here, you can tell me, but maybe it's not even like, he felt like, I delivered that speech with, verve and, pathos, and maybe that he did, but he's like, no, I spent time preparing and crafting. This is my magnum opus as I head into the twilight years. Is that what you would say?
He did. I mean, and the preparation for the speech, we know about it. He traveled over to the United States in January.
Okay.
He gave the speech in March, but
Right.
he arrived in New York on the Great Cunard, or the Queen Elizabeth, in January of 46. So he was, triumphantly, he was a celebrity,
Sure.
and there were interviews and press and so forth. And he said, "I'm going to Florida, I'm going to relax." He did what a lot of Americans in the world knows. Let's go to South Beach. beach and just relax for a while in the winter.
Right.
And he does. He goes to Miami Beach and spends some time there. And that's where he paints.
Right.
He does some correspondence, take a quick trip to Cuba to stock up on cigars and other things. And he puts together a message. And he takes that time in January and February to really hone in and crystallize his thoughts. I think he'd seen it from Yalta, where he sat down with Roosevelt and Stalin, and they were discussing, what things might look like after the war. Churchill knew then, and he knew even before the war, that the Soviet Union and communism was a threat. He knew also, though, that practically the Soviet Union was a necessary partner to defeat Hitler.
Absolutely.
But he knew that there was a warning, so he did use that time on American soil in Miami Beach to craft a really important message that was delivered in the middle of America.
That's fascinating. Okay, so now I know I've got some listeners, some young listeners who are saying, well, you guys are talking about speech writing and dry, dusty history. We're in the age of coronavirus and Twitter and race riots in the streets. So what does Churchill have to say? So let's shift gears a little bit, and with your knowledge of Churchill, and I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. So feel free to bifurcate them if you want, because we know he dealt with depression and discouragement. He called it the black dog would come to visit him, but then we also know that even through his political wilderness, for the decade of 29 to 39. He and even this building is a shining example of his ability to get smacked down and then pop back up. So in this age of coronavirus and hard times in the year 2020, it just seems like when is the difficulties going to end? What does Churchill have to teach us today about battling discouragement and getting back up again when you're in adverse circumstances? And take as long as you want here.
Well, I think the first thing that Churchill did was study history. He knew that we often say in the media or in letters, in these unprecedented times. Well,
right.
If you look at the vast history of our business, these aren't unprecedented times. I mean, the coronavirus is very serious, but so was the Black Plague.
Right.
So was the 1918 Spanish flu.
That's right.
We've been through this before, and a student of history, as Churchill was, knew it.
Right.
And he learned from that and said, he would always deliver the bad news first. He's like, this is bad, and I'm going to tell you how bad it is. And it doesn't look good. But together, and then he goes on using his gift of language and
oratory,
rhetoric to build confidence and inspire people that we can overcome this. It's been done before. He says grand statements like in the vast universe or in all of time, or if this is our finest hour. He uses history and the idea of time to say that we've been through hard times and we can come through it. That optimism of Churchill is, I think, something that comes through. And you're right, he did suffer from what he called the black dog from time to time. It was more of a situational depression. We all get that way.
Right.
And he would find ways to read, to write, to paint.
To paint, right.
He found, this is what really one of the first things that interested me in Winston Churchill. I came into the Churchill business through his painting. Not through history, not through World War II, but as an art historian, I was fascinated that a world leader would pause to pick up a paintbrush and to observe the natural world. And as eyewitnesses, family who pictured Winston Churchill behind a canvas said it was one of the few times he shut up. He was so concentrated on observing, translating what he saw into color and light. It's the same thing he did with his speeches.
Right.
He observed and he found the right words and he painted phrases and words. And it's the same thing he does with his statesmanship and his diplomacy. He looks, he observes, he translates, and comes up with a composition, whether it's policy, military strategy, a paint shadow, a particular turn of phrase. It's that mind of Winston Churchill, the curiosity, the optimism, the resilience. These are leadership qualities that transcend any time and place.
Right.
I mean, we can think of Churchill as this aristocratic British cigar-smoking hat, fancy suits. That's all part of his persona, but at the heart of it, it's his mind and his curiosity that sets him apart, and that's what fascinates so many people and so many leaders.
Right.
I mean, even today, CEOs, military leaders, statesmen, presidents, prime ministers quote Winston Churchill.
Oh, of course.
They look to him for leadership 55 years after his death, let alone nearly 150 years after his birth. And that's their staying power there.
Yeah.
And I think the deeper you look into Churchill's life and his legacy, the more you see. And Churchill said famously, and I'm paraphrasing here, the farther you look back, the
Right.
farther forward you will see.
Right.
And I think there's truth to that.
Right.
He believed it, and we believe it today. And
Right.
if you come to a place like the Churchill Museum, and history seems old, dusty, we're not doing our job. Especially with Winston Churchill, because there's so much in
Right.
him that makes him come alive.
Right. There's so much life in him. And I know that you're closed right now for renovations, but when you do reopen, I don't think there's anybody that can come through here and be bored. I mean, it's just fascinating what you guys have done in there, and it's very real life. I mean, I have twin daughters who are 10. I can't wait to bring them here. Now, one of the things when you began to answer that last question, you talked about how he overcame adversity and the Black Dog, and it was through his love of history. And then I also want to tie back into something you said about the speech where he tied everything in with the Declaration of Independence and history. And our founding fathers, one of the things that author Os Guinness says is they used history to defy history.
Mm-hmm.
And so he means by that is they looked through the annals of time and they were like, okay, if we are going to create an experiment in ordered liberty, we're going to look back through Periclean Athens and Elizabethan England and all of these times in order to set up a tripartite system of government. And so it's amazing to me that Churchill understood that in the speech and then in his personal life too. We have to look through history. And then, I don't know if he was officially a Stoic philosopher, but that's part of Stoic philosophy is you prepare for the worst and you look through history. And yeah, you don't discount it or just say, oh, just suck it up, buttercup, like we would say in the military. No, this is real. Coronavirus is real. But hey, our forefathers have been through this, and you need to expect difficulties in life. Life is not easy, and through optimism and a cheery disposition and an overcoming attitude in the special operations, we call it the internal dialogue. And it's interesting to me, Mr. Riley, some of the special operators I've worked with, some of them are huge. They're 6'5", 240 pounds. But others of them are like 5'4", 130 pounds smoking wet, and you're like, well, what is that? That's because their mind game is strong, the mental game. And so Churchill had probably the strongest mental games of any world leader.
Right, and I think he used history and the other great intellectual tools he had in his vast toolbox to prepare to innovate.
Yeah.
I mean, he would look back, but he was always experimenting. He loved technology.
Yeah.
He was asking the big questions.
Yeah.
He was a philosopher. He wrote a great essay in the 30s, questioning, is there extraterrestrial life? Asking the biggest question of all.
Right.
And then he answers it by using science to say, well, if there is, there have to be moons or planets that are not too hot, not too cold, because you need water. I mean, he goes through the whole exoplanet theory in the 1930s on the eve of World War II. He's thinking about the biggest questions. It's that mind, and he's always innovating.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what makes him, so part of his genius.
All right, so I want to get into some fun stuff here in a minute, but since we're on this history, and you've kind of answered that, why is history so important? You just really answered that already, so I'm not going to specifically ask that, although feel free to talk some more about it. I want to talk about, okay, so people, some of the anarchists now in the streets are tearing down statues, and there's some neo-Marxist ideology, some Saul Alinsky rules for radicals, fomenting revolution and all this stuff in the streets. What would Churchill say about that? Like if he was alive today and had a Twitter account, what would Churchill be tweeting about tearing down the statues and neo-Marxism and Saul Alinsky?
Well, the quickest answer is we don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
fair enough.
It's impossible to say. we can speculate.
Sure.
But when Churchill died in 1965, the world was also a tumultuous place.
Right.
In the 1960s.
In the 60s, sure.
We might have some idea, but we simply don't know and can't, because so much. Churchill was a man of the moment. He used everything that he could. He loved Twitter. I think he'd like to see the tweets.
Right.
Whether he could keep up with all the information, I'm not sure any of us can.
Yeah.
But I think, Churchill was a man of great tradition. He loved monuments. He loved pageantry. He would want to preserve the past and learn from it. I think he would certainly be concerned that we were indiscriminately, we as civilization people today who are protesting are tearing down statues just because it's a statue without any kind of discernment. There's that great statue that came down recently in Madison, Wisconsin, of an abolitionist.
Right.
It was pulled through the streets.
Right.
And I think it's because people didn't know.
Yeah, they don't know their history. Yeah,
and
sure.
I think Churchill would be upset by that.
Right.
Because just because everyone is tearing down statues, I got to do it too, is not
right.
the recipe. In fact,
right.
I see that as that's job security for museums like ours.
Right.
We have to teach history.
Right. Right.
And I think that's critically important. As far as revolution and the idea of protest, I think we have a monument on this campus that is a power to peaceful revolution. The Berlin Wall.
Right.
I mean, look at it. I mean, it's graffiti clad. It was ugly. It was the ultimate symbol. It was the Iron Curtain.
Right.
That came down without
a single shot fire.
A single shot.
Right.
And the fact that Churchill's granddaughter decided, and she's got her grandfather's DNA to be sure, that was a monument worth relocating from Berlin to Fulton, Missouri, and re-erecting here. But not only re-erecting as a wall, like you see it in some museums, but she carved through, these figures, and you can literally break through. That's the title of the sculpture. This sculpture. I think that creativity, finding creative solutions to these things and sort of just reactionary, would be what Churchill would embrace. In fact, his granddaughter did and does. So it's troubling when we see these indiscriminate or seemingly indiscriminate protests where people don't realize what they're doing.
Right.
And it's really a call for education and study and pausing and sitting down to talk. Churchill was loved the power of language.
Right.
And loved debate.
Right. Conversationalist.
I think he would argue, again, I can speculate here, that he said, paraphrasing here, that it's better to jaw than to war. He wanted to talk things out. I think he would promote the kind of dialogue and debate and discourse, even if it's he could get very heated. He could disagree with you vehemently in the House of Commons. He could take you down, with a turn of phrase.
Right.
But then have lunch with you.
Right.
It's that kind of magnanimity that Churchill exhibited that is seemingly lost today. I think he would probably be discouraged that we've lost that there's so much divisiveness. I mean, he have forgotten of some of the greater principles.
Right. That's a terrific answer. And so that's kind of a heavy subject that we just talked about. So let's turn to something fun. Tell me, and even as you're talking about, Churchill being, this great conversationalist, I've read a lot of books about Churchill, as I've shared with you. He's my favorite, world leader of all time. And, he would hold court, and I can't remember if it was Chartwell or what the house was, that he would go away from Downing Street, and he would just hold court, until 2, 3 in the morning, with people walking around in a silken robe, with a brandy and a cigar, and, he would have his coterie there, people. So tell us, I have some favorite stories of mine from my reading, but tell us, what are your favorite Winston Churchill stories? That's a tough question.
It is.
That's why I said not the favorite, some favorite, because it's hard to choose.
One that comes to mind, I think, and it's not necessarily that lighthearted. I mean, the 2 o'clock in the morning, the relationship Churchill had with his assistants and secretaries is a fascinating story.
Right.
I mean, could you imagine having to work with Winston Churchill until 2 o'clock in the morning?
I know.
There's a great story that comes to mind. In April 10th, 1945, Winston Churchill. It's near the end of the war. It's almost a month before VE Day. Churchill sees it's going to end.
Right.
He's feeling good.
Mm-hmm.
He's feeling really good. And his daughter Mary Soames, Mary Churchill at the time, was fighting for the British, and she was in Belgium, and manning,
artillery, right?
An anti-aircraft, battery.
Yep.
And she had just been awarded an MBE, a distinguished award, and Churchill writes her a letter saying, "Congratulations, Mary, you've got your MBE. Mummy and I are really proud of you." And he as Churchill normally did, he dictated this to a secretary who typed it up, and then she typed it up, and he went off to dinner with Bernard Baruch, the great American. They had a great time at the Savoy. They had this huge Churchillian celebration and dinner, and he was in a great mood. Comes back to the office to go back to work. He goes back to work. God knows what time it is in the morning. But he finds the letter that the secretary had written. "Oh, this is the one to Mary. She's got the MBA. I got to sign it." He then gets the news from America that Franklin Roosevelt had died.
Oh, man.
And he takes his pen and he writes, "Dear Mary, you know how this hits me." He's realizing that he's lost the greatest ally and friend,
right.
And it's that joy of emotion
right.
and the sadness,
Yeah.
and he signs the letter, So we have this letter in the archive here of that letter, and you see this on the one hand congratulatory note that takes him out to rejoice and have a nice cigar and brandy and champagne, and comes back
right.
and boom, he gets hit.
Yeah.
And it's those moments of Churchill that are incredible, that make him. You see the humanity.
Absolutely, and that really is a terrific story because he did undulate. I don't know if I would say wildly, because that has maybe a bad connotation to it, but he really was a man of passion, of pathos. And he could be angry with someone one minute, as you said, and the next minute, just giving him a hug, and that's what I think people loved about Churchill. It was his authenticity. You never had to guess with Winston Churchill, and I think that's a great aspect of leadership. That from his life I've extrapolated with my team when I used to lead soldiers is I don't want to play any passive aggressive games with them. Like, I want them to know what they're going to get, and I want them to know, because there are times, when you need to bring correction to someone, and you may need to bring it forcefully, hopefully not, but sometimes there are, and you want them to know that you love them, and so anything that you do with them is based off of a foundation of love. Like, I'm not leading you through fear, I'm leading you through love, and love is the counterpoise to fear. And I think that Churchill, even as you talk about that, you're talking about his daughter and FDR, both his family and his external family through politics, he loved deeply, and that was that undulation. Okay, so we could talk Churchill stories, like literally we could fill up 10 hours, right? So I'm going to shift gears here. Tell me some of your favorite Churchill pithy one-liner witticisms, or two-line, just like off the top of your head.
Oh boy.
This is what he's. We got a whole booklet of them right here.
Yeah, there's the stories about the one I like is when he lost the election in 1945. It's actually the line that helped him get to Fulton. He loses the election, the general election of 1945. He's no longer prime minister, and his wife Clementine says to him, trying to console him, Winston, I think this is a blessing in disguise. It's been 6 years of war, he's out of prime minister, we can finally relax. And he says, well, it's very effectively disguised. It's the perfect response.
Right.
And for Churchill, he was such a great reader.
Right.
And he had such an amazing memory. Many of those one-liners, many of those quotes are recycled and reused, not only from his long life, decades before, but other authors.
Right.
And if he saw something, read something, even 20 years, 30 years ago, he would it would be in there, almost as if he was waiting to use it.
Yeah.
I can imagine Churchill's mind, like, thank you for telling me, Clementine. You're queuing me up. I'm gonna
Right,
boom.
right.
And it's that preparation which is fascinating to me. But that's one. There's so many.
Yeah, there really are, and I would encourage anybody to get a book like this. Now, in this museum, we can't show it to them right now, but if they go back and look at the previous video podcasts, toward the end of that, we showed them. You actually have a room in the museum. What is it called?
The Wit and Wisdom Room.
The Wit and Wisdom Room, right. And so on the walls there, and I know it's being renovated right now, so you're going to rehang up some pictures, but it has this really nice gold filigree lettering around the wood panels of his quotes. And then you have these state-of-the-art TV screens and like little leather smoking chairs where you can sit down. This place is really quite amazing. Okay.
One thing about the quotes, I
Yes,
should advise that get a good book.
Okay.
A really good book, or better yet, get Churchill's writings.
Right.
Because there are a lot of quotes out there that are attributed to Churchill.
Or misattributed.
That are
yeah.
in this age of the internet or
sure.
Twitter, they're propagated.
Right.
I mean, I saw it on the internet. It's got
right.
to be true. And some of them are very Churchillian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they sound good. You want to believe he said it.
Right.
In fact, some of them I believe Churchill wished he had said.
Right.
But be careful of attributing it. We see, we get calls monthly from the media saying, "Oh, did the governor of so and so say this, or did so and so say
mm-hmm.
that?" And we all get it wrong. I've done that early in my career.
Sure.
I was called out, and I'll never forget it. But be careful and study history and cite it.
So I'm so glad you brought that up because one, I tell my daughters, I mean they're not searching the internet yet, but I'm like, hey, you don't believe everything that's on Wikipedia. Number one, all right. Actually, I don't believe hardly any. I just don't even use Wikipedia. And so two, you say, hey, get some good books about Churchill. All right, there's literally hundreds of books that have been written about Churchill. All right, so for somebody in their 20s and 30s, give me like the kind of list, like how would you start them off? Is this, are we talking Sir Martin Gilbert? Are we talking the Andrew Roberts? Are we talking Splendid in the Vial that just came? Right. Give a young person, because some of these Martin Gilbert books, I mean they're gonna be intimidating to somebody in their 20s. I mean they should read them because Sir Martin Gilbert was amazing and he's the official biographer, right. Of Winston Churchill while he was alive. But help us out here. Give us a roadmap to reading for Winston Churchill.
Well, asking the question of which book should I start is like trying to pick your favorite kid. Some you like more than others.
I'm putting you on the spot here.
Some you don't want. But Martin Gilbert was the official biographer,
yeah.
and his multi-volume set is worth reading, but
right.
not the place to start.
Right.
Maybe the one volume, A Bridge for Americans,
mm-hmm.
Gilbert's Churchill in America.
Yes,
is fascinating because
it
really
one.
looks
yes.
at Churchill's relationship with the United States. I think that's
it's a tremendous book.
A great way to start. Andrew Roberts is written the most recently.
Right.
He's written the best single volume.
I agree.
It really is. I mean, it's 900 pages.
It's
so
massive.
It really could be more than one volume.
Right.
I told Andrew, I said, this is a heavy book for one volume.
It hurts that spine every time.
But it's also good. But I think if you had to start, I would start by reading Churchill himself.
Okay.
I mean, he was a historian.
Yeah.
He was a writer. And if you really want to begin to understand Winston Churchill, why not go to the primary source, Churchill
right.
himself?
Right.
I got into Churchill, as I said earlier, by through his paintings.
Mm-hmm.
His essay, Painting as a Pastime, was written in essay form in 1921 and 1920, published in book form in 1948. But it's a slim volume called Painting as a Pastime. It's personal.
Okay.
He talks about painting, sure, color and light, but he talks about his battle with the Black Dog,
yep.
Adversity,
yep.
and he uses, or some of his essays from the 1930s.
Yep.
Read Churchill. If you want to know Churchill, read Churchill.
I love that. Yeah.
Go on
yep.
to read about like Andrew Roberts or Martin
yeah.
Gilbert or so many other historians. That's where they started.
Right. That's a great answer. And I didn't know about the Painting as a Pastime. I'm gonna go.
It's
now,
one of my favorite little books.
Is that still like published today? If we went on Amazon,
you can
get
find
that?
it.
You can find it. Okay, great. All right, so just a couple more questions for you, and then I know you want to show us something which is remarkable. And some of this we've already touched on in some of your answers, but I want to just kind of give us some really focused time here because of coronavirus and everything we're in. Talk to us, Mr. Riley. How do you think Winston Churchill inculcated hope in England during her darkest hour? Like you talked a little bit about the power of language and all that stuff. Like get us inside of his head. Like what was he thinking? Like he obviously saw the times. He was, as you said, prescient. He was a political prophet. Like what he and when he came, I'm sorry, I'm going on here a little bit too long in this introduction to the question, but it's famous, May 9th, 1940. So after he meets with King George and he comes out of the political wilderness, he said, I feel like my whole life had been but a preparation for this moment. And then he goes on to say, and I'll have to paraphrase it because I can't remember it, but he basically says, I had everything at my disposal and the power was mine to direct the course of human events for England. So
he was walking with destiny.
He was walking with destiny, right? Andrew Roberts,
Right.
the title of his new book that you mentioned. So how did he actually flesh that out? Talk to us about that because I think that'll give people hope today.
Sure. Well, I think in the coronavirus era where so many people have been sheltered, we'll talk about other books. Eric Larson's new book, The Splendid and the Vile.
It's tremendous.
He's a Churchill Fellow at Westminster College now, and he writes about the Blitz.
Mm-hmm.
And Churchill became prime minister in May of 1940, and talk about uphill climb.
Oh my gosh.
France falls.
Right.
Dunkirk needs to be dealt with. They need to evacuate the British troops. And it's a miraculous operation that these small boats carry hundreds of thousands of troops away from the enemy lines back to England. But and people were thankful and great. But Churchill rightly says, well, this is not a victory. This is a retreat.
Right.
Right. And we should feel good about it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, things were going down. And Eric Larson talks about, right after that, the Blitz starts. The Battle of Britain, and London's being pummeled and bombs, and England is standing alone. And Churchill does something clever. He tells the bad news first. He says, this is not good, but I believe that if we work together, if we stand up and, we count in our own principles and our history and our legacy, we can overcome this.
Right.
And he uses language, metaphors, and speeches, and cleverly, radio,
right.
To reach large audiences. And alliance building to inspire. Not everyone agreed, but it was enough. It was certainly enough to give hope.
Yeah.
In the face of adversity. And I think Churchill again instilled that confidence by saying, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is bad.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Yep.
And I think again, we don't know what he would say today.
Right.
With the virus, but he did say actually in a great speech, I think right towards the end of the war, right after, to the Royal College of Physicians in London, he talks about disease, and we have to attack the disease. He says, we have to
attack the disease.
And he thought about it as a battle plan, and
I love
and
that.
gave confidence that we can do this. And if we rally, just like we do militarily, strategically, come up with a concept, come up with a plan, and then execute that plan, we can be victorious. And he said he approached that with the disease. Wow. It's an extraordinary way to do that. And I think, Churchill shined in adversity.
Right.
He was built for it.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of experience with it.
Right.
And he had a certain empathy, and through his language, through his belief, through his power, power of words, could inspire others to follow suit.
Yeah.
And it worked, and it continues to work to this day.
So I love that. I'm just going to pull out two things real quick. So one, attack the disease, and I know. So he was a man of action. Through his whole life, a man of action, and even. He went through voluminous amounts of papers every day and taskers, especially in that 1940 to 41, and he would slap on a file action this day. Right. Like he had like stamps or stickers made or whatever for action this day, And I think that really does speak to us today in the coronavirus, because a lot of people, are just like, well, I'm at home, and there's nothing that I can do. But like, there are ways that you can find to take action and use your creative genius, like Churchill did, to lead your family and to stay positive. And then I also like, and it's the second time you brought it up in this interview, where you said, Churchill led with the truth. He led with, hey, well, the whole thing was the truth, but he led with, hey, the predicament is dire. So he wasn't Pollyannish about it. He wasn't saying, this isn't a big deal, there's nothing to see here, because I think people have lost trust in their institutions today. And I'm not trying to cast blame on anybody, but, so Congress's approval rating is like less than 10%. Like, our people, we don't trust our institutional leaders anymore. Right. And if you look at Churchill back then, like, his popularity was never higher than in the midst of this crisis. He would go through the streets and people would flock to him. Right. And I think that's partly because he was honest with them. Right. And he was like, hey, this is terrible, but we are going to get through this together. Right. So I love that you brought that out. Okay, I have one more question, but I'm going to close with it. So why don't you show us this special gift that you have, or not gift, but yeah, yeah. Do you want to give it to us, Mr. Riley?